But on the economic side, my penultimate question for you, Vlad, is simply there's a certain degree of economic disillusionment that I think Putin has at this point, to the point where he is making provocations into NATO airspace. Right? For me, quite simply, this doesn't come from a place of strength. It comes from a place of desperation or growing anxiety from the Kremlin because they are feeling the squeeze. I'm not going to say the economy in Russia is going to imminently collapse, because I'm not one of those people who, well, constantly say that every day, but it isn't pretty and it is catching up with the Kremlin. So, what do you think about Putin's state of mind about the economy and how he still continues to preside over it?
I think that Putin is perhaps less anxious than your comment may suggest about this. He thinks that there are significant structural problems in the Russian economy, and he realizes that what he is doing is not sustainable in the medium term. At the same time, we have to realize, and this is something Trump doesn't realize, which is why he's had to cancel the Hungarian rendezvous. This is not a war of choice for Putin in Putin's mind. This is a defensive, existential war where what's at stake is regime security. And if regime security is at stake, then Putin's life is at stake. So what Putin is doing in Ukraine is enormously important to him. It's not just another foreign incursion of the kind that empires indulge in and he could suspend it and then see how he goes. What he's doing is very, very important for him. So as I would currently weigh it, the pressure to avoid an independent Ukraine is 5 times greater than the pressure to try to alleviate the stresses on the Russian economy. He's feeling the pressure, but is also understanding that he's doing something very, very important. And the only way he would stop doing it is if his power was at stake. And here I think it's very important to remember a few minor things. The Russian economy is struggling on a range of measures that we can all see. But it's very important that when we look at Russia, we recognize that it's not a democracy. The kinds of economic crisis that would bring down any Western government are not going to bring down the Putin regime. They might not even destabilize it. So that's one factor that we need to consider. We often look at that and say, well, even if we had half of that in our country, our government would be at 12% in the polls and they'd be out. There's also a degree of magical thinking in the way we use the term economic collapse, which in fact people substitute for the term political collapse. But you have to have a cause and effect relationship there. So I'm asking people to say to themselves, okay, let's say the Russian economy is really in a bad place on a range of measures, and that's truly true, and it's going to get worse. It's going to be much worse in 2026 for the Russians than it is today. But then we need to give an account, how does this bring down the Putin regime? Like what happens, right? So we need a political account of change before we sort of go on using as confidently as we are using this term economic collapse, where in fact we're building in some political assumptions that have not been worked out at all. Here is another thing we need to consider. Economic hardship does not equal anti-regime protest in Russia. It might actually equal consolidation more than it does political protest. Look at these bad Westerners. They have done this to us. So what I'm saying is that the Russian economy is genuinely in trouble on a range of very significant measures, but we've got to assess it properly without magical political assumptions being structured in, without magical thinking about the nature of Russian politics. That's to say, Russia is an authoritarian regime that's currently stable. These are regimes that can unravel in a 6-month period because of the complexity and informality of infrastructure that holds them together. But nevertheless, it looks to us stable for now. So the kind of economic crisis that brings down Western governments is not the kind of economic crisis that brings down Russian or Chinese governments. You've got to realize that. Also, economic hardship for Russians who are going to feel inflation, we're going to feel access to daily consumable goods becoming harder. That's not going to translate into opposition to Putin. Having accepted all of this, we've then got to create a sort of scale for ourselves and say, if we're talking about supporting Ukraine, What truly matters isn't the weakness of the Russian economy, but the relative weakness of the Russian economy compared to Ukraine's economy. And so what's missing from this conversation is how weak Ukraine's economy is. And that on many measures, the Ukrainian economy is doing worse than the Russian economy. A lot worse. A lot worse. And so what we've got to understand is that what we're after is, if we want to defeat the Putin regime, is its relative weakness compared with Ukraine, compared with where Ukraine is with and without our support. So we've got this culture where too often we have conversations about the difficulties Ukraine faces and the difficulties the Russians face. We don't have enough discourse in our culture about the relative weakness. Who is losing the war faster? Is it Ukraine? Is it Russia? That's also a conversation you need to build into any economic analysis. But the broad picture that things are trending south for the Russian economy is very true. They are concerned about it. But it seems to me that this is not reaching a point of imminent threat of power destabilization for Putin. And therefore, unfortunately, even with the latest sanctions that look harsher than they are, Putin is not going to be forced to significantly change course in the short term.
No, it is not, for sure, in the short term. And I think one point that you made is very important, which is there's a lot of emphasis on the Russian state of the economy and the state of the population as well. But it's very clear that Russia has it tough, but Ukraine does have it tough. And that's not suddenly being, taking sides. But the reality is that Ukraine's entire economy is supported by external sources. And the population situation in Ukraine, well, the TFR, total fertility rate, is even lower in Ukraine than it is in Russia. So we can talk about declining populations, but it's very much the case in all of Eastern Europe, has been since the end of the Cold War, and Hungary as well.
If you're